reported, of course there's no reporters in there, but reported, linked very clearly, having said to Southeast Asian disputants, saying, China is a big country, you are a small country, and our claims are more important than you, or than yours rather. And so you're not going to see that, but you're going to see continued efforts to isolate each of the contested claimants. Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, are all going to be, China's going to continue to try to pick them off and to continue to try to wedge ASEAN and reduce what is already a fairly limited capacity, because one shouldn't, in Australia one very rarely overstates ASEAN's capacities. But I think China will continue to work on ASEAN member states who are not claimants to ensure that ASEAN unity on this issue is broken. I think you're going to continue to see militarisation of these disputes, but equally the PLAN, so the formal navy is not going to participate in any of this, so that China can say these are domestic issues, these are policing issues, so that when Indonesian fishermen, Philippines fishermen, Vietnamese or Indian or other private sector firms that are drilling or exploring these potential hydrocarbon reserves can be dealt with for breaches of what China perceives to be its domestic sovereignty and domestic law. And I think what we're going to see in 2014 is that the basic structure of East Asia's regional order, in which for the past 25 or 30 years American military predominance has been the rule of thumb, that the American Navy and American general political and diplomatic will has predominated on the high seas, that's been questioned for the past 2 or 3 years by China's activity, and that's going to continue to occur. And that America is going to find managing and responding to this and to its allies increasingly difficult, which is a neat segue to my second point, which is about America and the pivot. You'll recall that from around 2000 and early 2011 onwards, the American administration, the Obama administration, has made the pivot to Asia the sort of centerpiece of its foreign policy. And the pivot to Asia was very easy to describe in one sense, in that it was a pivot away from Southwest Asia, so moving away from the focus on Iraq and Afghanistan. What I think the administration has never really successfully sold is what's the pivot to, because of course, it comes from a basketball move and you're moving away from something, of course, everyone is being moved away from. Read Europeans, we're like, well, we don't like this. And unless you happen to be Nouri al-Maliki or the Taliban, you think it's a terribly good idea that you're being pivoted away from by the United States, but that's for another day. What the Obama administration has done, though, is sought effectively to say, I think with the pivot, to do a number of things. First is to signal very clearly that Asia is its preeminent strategic concern. So it's not about Iraq, it's not about Afghanistan, it's not about terrorism or Islam, it's about Asia, and about the transformation of Asia's geopolitics because of the rise of China. And there's no great complexity in all of that. But it was also about signalling internal political priorities. The Obama administration inherited an economic basket case in terms of its own budget and in terms of the broader economy of the United States. Cuts were always going to occur across the board of government spending, particularly in its foreign affairs, in its military and its diplomacy. A pivot to Asia says that's where our financial priorities are going to be. So if you want to do anything, i.e. internally, whether it's about force acquisition, about redeployment of troops, whether it's about new kit you're going to acquire, whatever, it all has to be understood in terms of the big strategic plan and the focus on Asia. Third was about keeping the allies happy and not just keeping them happy in the sense that America stays up at night thinking what Australia and Japan and Korea worries about, but rather that America knows that its interest in and its capacity to exert influence in Asia is dependent on its relations with its allies. So it's a very curious sort of type of hegemony, if you want to call it that, in that it is dependent upon good relations with Japan, Korea, Australia, Singapore and others, because America is so physically far from this region and yet wants to and has been here for a long period of time. And finally, we saw with the pivot a focus on a much broader conception of America's role in Asia. And broader understood both in the geographic reach, so you saw the incorporation of South Asia into a broader conception of Asia. So India particularly was brought into an understanding of Asia, really up until that point being quite separate in the way America thought about and approached the region. But also an expansion of policy tools and to very in a very high-profile way, nicked economic concerns into what America was doing. And that's just that, and we saw that first the involvement in multilateral processes, and then most recently the very, very heavy, I would say, somewhat heavy-handed emphasis on the TPPs, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement. So that started in 2011. Since 2012, doubts about this policy have crept in. So confidence in American pivot lasted about a year. Doubts appeared for a whole range of reasons, and kind of got to the high point about the doubts around American credibility and commitment to the pivot, of course, peaked when Obama had to cancel the trip to the region that was scheduled for October of last year because of the domestic problems related to the budget. But more generally, you have seen, not just because Obama couldn't go because of the domestic optics of it, although some people have argued, I think probably rightly, that he probably could have gone if he really wanted to spend capital in that regard, but felt on balance it probably wasn't worth it. The Malays, you could keep the Malays happy for another 6 or 8 months and you can go, and he's going to come in April. But you saw also in the number of high-level visits by the Secretary of State, the appointment of a very clearly Atlanticist-focused Secretary of State, a UN-focused national security advisor. You compare the interest in Asia between Clinton and what's it called, Blake?
Kirk Campbell.
No, not Kirk Campbell, the old national security advisor. First term.
No.
Rice.
So, someone Google it for me.
Condi
No,
Rice.
I've gone completely.
Condi Rice.
He was the architect of the pivot.
Oh, Richard Fisher.
No, someone could,
Armitage.
National Security Advisor in Obama's first term.
Okay.
A very deliberately low profile guy. So with his departure, so what we saw is he was very focused on Asia. You had a very high profile East Asian, Assistant Secretary for East Asian Affairs in Kirk Campbell. You had a Secretary of Defense, Gates, who was heavily focused on Asia. And you had a president who spoke a lot about Asia in his first term. Pacific president, went to Jakarta, spent his childhood there, that sort of thing. Since then, the number of visits by senior officials has dropped dramatically, and not just the people at the very top, but further down the food chain. The only senior official who travels regularly to the region is Chuck Hagel, and most Americans will tell you that's not necessarily a productive thing. So personnel changes go some of the reason. I think there was also a very deliberate strategy from 2012 onwards to dial down the language of the pivot. Because what the pivot certainly did produce was a reaction from China. So one of the reasons you saw a continuation of a more assertive approach by China was that China felt that it not necessarily had to respond overtly, but it had to be seen to be responding, especially in the lead up to the 2012 transfer of power to Xi Jinping and the fifth generation. So that the sort of more rightist forces in the PLA and elsewhere in the party are sitting there going, America's pivoting to Asia. It's not him. I will find, when Mike's talking, I will find this guy's name, get back to him. It's a senior's moment. I'm having them more and more. I blame the third child, but anyway.
Stephen Hadley?
Stephen Hadley. Yeah. I'm losing my train of thought. So the second point is, China felt cornered by, well not cornered, but China felt that it had to respond to an American pivot. And that America's language since 2012 to focus a little less clearly on the pivot, a little less heavy, dial the language down about the pivot. And you hear much less about 2/3 of American military assets will be in Asia now. And you hear much more about trade and economy and this sort of thing. So I think there's been a deliberate effort to wind back the pivot because in many respects, as a lot of people pointed out, the pivot was mostly rhetorical and not actually substantive in terms of changing American policy in the region. And of course, we know problems in the pivot also you can slate back to the challenges to the American domestic political system and the gridlock in Congress around the budget. So what's America got in 2014 to look forward to? Well, probably first word is Abe, or more precisely, Abe and his Yasukuni problem. I think for America, the biggest challenge they've got is managing that ally, and particularly Japan, China, Japan-Korea relations, whilst Abe is going to continue to do these domestic political games around Japanese history. American policymakers were ropeable when he did his Boxing Day trip to Yasukuni Shrine. Partly because it was so soon after Vice President Biden had been, in which it is reported about Abe basically said, kind of gave him the nudge in the wings, didn't say I'm not going to go, basically said, you know, do you expect me to do foolish things, this kind of stuff, and then went. And so managing Japan, not in the sense of you've got to bring Japan to heel, that's never going to work either politically or strategically, but it is going to have to manage the regional consequences of having a Japan which is, for domestic reasons, going out of its way almost to irritate the neighbours. And then America has a very big promise. It's basically got a blank check to Japan. It's not quite a blank check, but it's nearly a blank check. So alliance management with Japan is going to be a huge issue. Other challenges for 2014 include, and this is important for Australia, the growing expectation that the allies in Asia will need to do more. They need to carry more weight, they need to spend more, and they need to do more to provide the foundations for American regional order. And this is something that is being noted very clearly in Canberra, and the current government is very supportive of it and actually very keen to do more. Now, whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing, we can talk about that in the Q&A, but very clearly the Abbott government sees this and thinks that it can and will do more, and it will be interesting to watch the next white paper that's being written. There's clearly money in writing white papers. Someone is doing well out of defence white papers. Someone has to be, because it's certainly not Australian defence policy. Third thing I think is 2014 will be difficult for America is managing regional expectations, because yes, you've got big formal allies like Australia, Korea, and Japan who expect certain things from an alliance, but equally because you've got formal alliance, your senior ally partner can expect certain other things back. But there's lots of others in the region who are expecting a lot out of the US. Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore. These are countries for whom there is not an alliance relationship, but who are expecting in America to provide basically the underpinnings of the status quo, which is going to cost America essentially more and more every year, diplomatically, strategically, and politically. America will spend 2014 trying to see off the doubts that exist, and I think they'll do that less and less successfully. So we've seen Obama has just announced this morning, Australia time, so yesterday afternoon, Washington time, that he's going to go to Asia, make up for the missed trip last time. And when they first floated this, or flew this kite, they said, we're going to go to Japan, we're going to go to Malaysia, we're going to go to the Philippines. Who went crazy? The Koreans, saying, what about us? So now they've hastily said, oh yeah, yes, of course we're going to go to Seoul. So life is tricky, and is going to continue to be tricky for the Americans to manage these regional expectations and regional commitments. As China's assertiveness grows, America's capacity to manage the regional response to this is going to be stretched. And I'm not convinced, given their domestic political challenges and the focus of the key principles elsewhere, John Kerry spends most nights thinking about the Arab-Israeli dispute, rightly and wrongly, that they're going to quite be up to this. So finally, I've spoken for a bit longer than intended, but finally to say a few quick things about North Korea. We saw during the Northern Hemisphere winter, Kim 3.0 consolidate the transition from daddy to son. He did this in a fairly extraordinarily public purge of his uncle, which, you probably saw plenty of Games of Thrones and Pyongyang style stories, and it was, literally that kind of thing, the public purging of the uncle, who had smoothed his transition to power. I mean, this is the guy who was the regent. He was the chair of the military commission. This is the second most powerful person in North Korea. It's publicly, literally defenestrated and then executed. Large extended family murdered, the rest of them exiled. And there's all sorts of speculation as to precisely why it occurred, but the principal reason I think most of us are settling on is it was about consolidation of Kim, the third Kim regime, ensuring that all the relations with the rest of the world, principally with China, are run through him and not through his uncle, because the uncle was seen as Beijing's principal interlocutor, and also, footnote, making lots of money out of the China trade. What can we expect from North Korea? This is not a state that is going to collapse this year or anytime soon. North Korea is richer than it's been in about 15 years. Why is it rich? It's got coal, lots of it. It's got the world's largest now proven reserves of rare earths, and it has a whole range of other mineral resources. There's a really interesting report written by Goldman Sachs on the economic potential of North Korea about a year ago, maybe 2 months ago. Probably the main people reading this report, I rather suspect, were the Politburo of the Korean Workers' Party. There has been significant Chinese investment in North Korea, and they're establishing special economic zones, kind of modelled very loosely on the Chinese special economic zones, in which there's one foreign investor allowed in, and that's an investor from China. So the state is going to be able to consolidate itself to the extent to which these really, really highly centralised authoritarian states can. What does that mean for how it's going to behave internationally? Is it going to make nice? Because there's one view that says a consolidated North Korea is one that feels comfortable in itself and can begin to negotiate with the rest of the world for a normalised integration to the global economy. And that's what the Chinese have been telling North Koreans for 20 years. Go down the path we've gone down. That's your only hope. Liberalise your economy. Don't liberalise your political system. Liberalise your economy and all will be well. And we can tell you how to do it. And we can both make lots of money along the way. I don't think North Korea is likely to do that anytime soon, although it may yet. But in the short to medium term, I think what consolidation is going to entail is an acceleration of the nuclear program. And I think 2014 is going to be the year when we finally accept the reality that North Korea will become a nuclear weapons state. It will conduct more nuclear tests. I reckon it'll do at least one nuclear test, probably in the next 3 to 6 months, to take further steps. I mean, it has to, if it wants to take the steps it needs to take to meet the requirements that you need to acquire a nuclear weapon, i.e. fissile, you do your explosion, you miniaturise it, you get a delivery system in which the whole package works. It has to do more tests. It's about time to do it. They're ramping up the prep for it, so it's likely to occur sometime soon. How we respond to this, and more pointedly how China and the United States responds to this, is going to be crucial in determining what the regional consequences are, something of a tautology. But more importantly, I think the best way in which we can deal with a nuclear North Korea is to accept a nuclear North Korea in the same way we've accepted a nuclear India and a nuclear Pakistan. That's to say, this is not an irrational regime. It's perfectly rational. It's very unpleasant. It treats its people with a very high degree of cruelty, but it's not irrational, and it can be deterred and it can be dealt with on those terms. And I think this is the year in which we come to terms with that. Very unpleasant, but nonetheless, I think, stark reality. North Korea is not going to negotiate its nuclear weapons away. I'll stop there because I have spoken for too long. Sorry, Mike.
No problem, Nick.
Well, that's a very difficult act to follow, so I'm going to change tactic completely, and I would not even hope to go into any of the detail that Nick's gone into on any subject. I'm speaking much more from a journalistic perspective, which of course is broad and general, and some of you might say without foundation. And there's no truth in that, but there is truth in saying that broad perspectives are important for us when we're looking at our position in the world, and that's what I want to be doing today. What I also want to focus on is perspective. It's very important for us to understand that to some people the economy is everything, and that's everything that they will talk about. You've heard Nick talk about effectively military, confrontation potential, and for many people that perspective is the issue that is most important globally. For some people, there are many issues of human welfare that are the most important things that they focus on, and human development. And of course, for many people, the most important things are what happen across the world in relation to whether or not the Australians will beat the South Africans, or whether or not we're going to win in the World Cup. By the way, I've got some bad news if you're following the World Cup. Friday the 13th of June is the day Australia plays Chile. And in that particular place, Coaba, which is right on the Pantanal in Brazil, beautiful part of the world. and I'm sure our players will enjoy it, even though it is Friday the 13th. I don't know whether that's an omen or not. But if we leave that aside, one of the things that I do think is true in relation to Australian journalism, and I'm talking about journalism here because this is effectively the public discourse of Australia, we tend to be excessively myopic. We tend to focus so fundamentally on ourselves that we neglect the rest of the world. So what I'm going to do today is just do a very scant view across a couple of areas of the rest of the world, and hopefully not go over any of the areas that Nick went over. I'm going to look at what we can predict, the unpredictable, a couple of global hotspots and hot issues from a different perspective, and an element of what I would call knowing our place in the world. I'm not an expert on any of these areas, I'd like to point out, and I'm not trying to display any viewpoint about any of these areas, simply to give you some coverage of some of the issues that are there. So firstly, let's go to what we can predict. And we do all know that this event is taking place in Brazil, in Brisbane. It might be Brisbane. Might as well be Brazil. Associated with the G20 are a number of, I've got an excuse for a seniors moment as well, and that is I'm about to be a grandparent. So. The G20 has a whole set of subset activities. It'd be interesting to just see a raise of hands. How many of you are aware of the events of the G20? Have you heard of the B20, the C20, the L20, the T20 and the Y20? How many? Raise hands. Okay, we've got half a dozen. That's fantastic. For you, I'm going to bore you. For the rest, I'm going to try and illuminate you. The B20 stands for the Business 20, fairly obvious. And that's led by Richard Goyder, Managing Director of Wesfarmers. The B20 is designed to bring business leaders from around the world together, and Australia leads that discussion this year under the auspices of the G20. The C20 stands for?
Civil society.
Civil society. Thank you very much. We're going to get some points over this side of the room. This side of the room has a lot of work to do. Civil society discussions are going to be taking place all around the world, and it says that the benefits of economic growth to reach everyone, particularly the most disadvantaged in our community. That's the objective of the civil society group working together. L, now, anybody from this side of the room understand what the L in L20 would stand for? Labour. Labour. Bringing together the leaders of labour around the world, and that's going to be led by the President of the ACTU, Geraldine Carney. Now, T20? No, not trade. Not tourism.
Technology.
Not technology. No, not. I think you might know. It's thinkers. It stands for thinking. The Thinking 20. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that Australia is hosting the G20 this year and is leading discussions in all these areas. There's also the Y20, by the way. Y stands for? Youth. I'm glad you could all work that one out. Now, it's interesting. We have this taking place. Currently, there are meetings around the world. There's a whole series of meetings that Australia is leading right around the world in all these areas. And how many of us have heard about these meetings and discussions that are going to take place or are taking place now? Okay, well then I think I've made my point. When we consider the G20, the event in Brisbane, which is in November this year, will be the Leaders' Summit and will be very important. I'm not pretending it won't be. It'll be really, really important. Australia will be on the world stage. We'll be leading this discussion of the top 20 economies of the world. But all this other discussion is the background to what will be decided. In fact, all this discussion that's taking place in the preceding 10 months will in fact be what drives the leaders' discussions and decisions that are made. Now, another area that I think hasn't received a lot of focus is in the area of the United Nations emphasis on its focal points for the year, and I'm using just one simple example of that, which is the declaration of the year of. So can anybody tell me what is this year the year of? A very Asian perspective from a very non-Asian audience, I might point out. Yes, the year of the horse, but that's not the United Nations Declaration, I'm sorry. Okay, I am going to tell you what it is. There it is. It's on the UN page. There are 4 this year. 4. It's the International Year of Crystallography. What is that? Now, it celebrates the 400th anniversary of Kepler's observation in 1611 of the symmetrical form of crystals, which began the wider study of the role of symmetry in matter. That's what it's about. What it's about is actually respecting and reflecting advances in science. And I think what we're seeing is a shift with the United Nations to try and say, hey, we're not just talking about general matters here, we're talking about things that are different. So this year they've declared this is the International Year of Crystallography. It's the international... Yes, every year there's a radio day there. Well, that started about 3 years ago or 4 years ago, I think. And there's a reason for that as well, which I won't go into now, but it's got to do with radio being the fundamental form of communication for the disadvantaged in the community. The International Year of Family Farming. Now, why do we have an International Year of Family Farming, you might ask? Well, it actually becomes quite obvious when you analyse it. There are 2 factors that run parallel to one another. One is excessive urbanisation, and that excessive urbanisation creates cities like Sao Paulo or cities like Jakarta, and the de-ruralisation of communities creates hunger and creates huge problems for people who have for years and years and years looked after themselves, suddenly becoming effectively refugees and people needing welfare. It's a really big issue. And I think the focus of family farming from the United Nations is a deliberate attempt to try and overcome some of the huge humanitarian problems that are facing the globe at the moment. Interestingly enough, if you look at this from an Australian perspective, family farming is a huge problem in Australia. It's almost impossible nowadays for people who run family farms to actually be able to make a living because of the complexities of the economy of rural lifestyles. So, International Year of Small Island Developing States. Australia has a huge role in relation to this. Small island developing states, if you look at the Pacific, would be a huge proportion of the number. So this actually, I don't know, hands up, how many people have heard about this? Not one? Yeah. Yet theoretically, Australia should, if this is actually a year of focus for the United Nations, Australia should be taking a leading role in relation to that. And the last one is, you might think this is particularly peculiar, I certainly did, International Year of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. Now, the reason I thought it was peculiar is not because solidarity with the Palestinian people is a problem, is because they're being singled out. And you would ask, why is that the case? Certainly from the Israeli perspective, it's a problem. I came across an article in the Jerusalem Post which said Palestinians and their undemocratic UN cohorts are off to a roaring start for 2014 because the UN propaganda campaign against the legitimacy of Israel has now reached epidemic proportions. So what we're talking about here is a hotspot of the world and a focus from the United Nations on trying to look at this from a range of different angles, but certainly not everybody will agree. There's going to be huge diversity of opinion about all of these subject matters, but they exist. The member states of the United Nations voted in resolutions to have all of these declared and are supposed to be elements of emphasis for the full year of 2014. Now, I want to turn a little bit of attention to the unpredictable. Now, what's that? Oh, it's not question time yet. However, because you're so beautiful and you're sitting up the front,
I just wanted to know, do you know how much money is allocated to each of these years?
well, as I indicated, Nick would be an expert on subjects. I'm a generalist, so no, I don't. However, it would be fairly easy for us to find out. I'm sure somebody could Google it while we're talking. Yeah, I think there was a comment that's relatively little. I don't think huge amounts. The objective normally of these declarations is for emphasis from member states and for publicity through media coverage, which there hasn't been any. So now, the unpredictable. Natural disasters are clearly unpredictable. Wars, conflicts, I would say economic recessions or depressions, pandemics. Who's going to win the World Cup? It's unpredictable. However, and I've been talking about this earlier today, Donald Rumsfeld in his classic line of 2002, I think it was, talking about the known knowns, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. He left one out, which is the unknown knowns. The unknown knowns, I'm going to say, relate to this, which is disaster. I can guarantee to you there will be disaster in one place or another, and there'll be more disasters than just one occurring across the world this year. And the question, of course, is who's prepared? What are they prepared for? What is Australia preparing for in relation to its support for other countries when they have disasters? I mean, we have enough of our own. Currently, there's a flood raging through the United Kingdom and a drought in the northeastern states of Australia. Those two disasters are quite significant and quite profound and will require an enormous amount of money and resources to go into them. Disasters will occur. Fires. Well, we've had our disasters just over the last week. Luckily, they weren't as bad as 5 years ago, but we face disaster on a regular basis. I would say it's an unknown known. It is, we know it will occur, it's just that we don't know what, and we don't know when. So those things are particularly important for us to consider. One of the other things that I'd like to talk about here is how Australia will engage in an area that I think again has received very little media coverage. In 2012 in Rio de Janeiro there was a big conference and they came up with the Rio Plus 20 resolutions, which were to finalise the Millennium Development Goals in 2015, and from 2016 the Sustainable Development Goals would be put into place. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals are designed to ensure that human welfare is increased sustainably, and the objective is to have especially developing countries be advantaged by the developed countries assisting as much as possible in framing what those Sustainable Development Goals will be in 2016. I've already mentioned that if you look at some states that are of concern in relation to their viability, you might look at Papua New Guinea or the Solomon Islands or Cambodia. Not that they necessarily have any problems in terms of social order, but in terms of poverty and in terms of human welfare, those countries have huge hurdles to overcome. So what we have to focus on is, will Australia in 2014 actually be involved in trying to frame what the sustainable development goals will be, because we will have a role with our neighbours to ensure that the states that surround us, our very closest neighbours, are viable and ongoing nations. Now, I want to turn our attention to the subject of refugees, and I don't want to turn our attention to this because it's my particular topic of interest, because it's continuously in the media, continuously being discussed, but from what perspective? And this, I think, is particularly important for us. Australia has a strong interest in asylum seekers, refugees, and we call them many names, including boat people. But if you actually look at the global issue associated with refugees, I'm going to read you out a few figures here. The UN High Commission for Refugees Global Trends, these are 2012 figures. 7.6 million people were newly displaced, another 6.5 million people, that's newly displaced across borders, the 7.6, another 6.5 displaced, that is losing their home and having to go on the streets within their countries. And if you look at the figures overall, the United Nations has of concern 36 million people around the world, but they classify as designated or recognised refugees 10.5 million people. It's a lot of people. Now, I looked at the Australian Parliament website to see what the Australians, what our Parliament tells us we have done in relation to this. Australia, by the way, and I'll come to this later on, is recognised in terms of GDP as the 12th biggest economy in the world. Australia is taking 0.0006% of the world's recognised refugees, because according to the website, we were taking, I think, I'm having my seniors moment here, I can't find my, my note on there. I think we're taking, it was 6, I'll have to come back to that and let you know, but it was a very, very low figure. And no, 6,000 it was. Out there were 30,000 applications, 30,000 offshore, 6,000 offshore were taken, that is from offshore, and another 6,000 onshore were processed as well and accepted. So a total of 12,000 refugees. This is from the Australian Parliament website. And we had an application for 30,000 offshore. So quite significantly, Australia is taking a fairly low number, especially when you consider that the United Nations says 80% of the world's refugees are hosted, that is taken, by developing countries. And they list Pakistan as taking about 1.3 million, Iran taking 868,000, Germany 589,000, and the next was Kenya at 565,000. Australia is taking 6,000. Now, I think what we need to do is consider, I'm not making a value judgment about whether we should determine who comes to Australia or not. What I am saying is we should be reporting the numbers in terms of world numbers, not just looking at what Australia is doing in isolation. It doesn't make sense. Now, Nick's talked about some hotspots, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Yeah, okay. What I do want to say is we've got a couple of elections around the world. In fact, just about every continent of the world has several elections, especially Brazil, Colombia, Indonesia, South Africa, Turkey. The elections in those countries might be predictable, but if they come out differently, it will have some significant impact on the world. And I do want to talk about technology briefly. Technology will continue to change the world over the next year, as it has in the year gone by, and it has in the year that preceded that. And every year the changes seem to be going at an almost exponential increase. Whether we will continue to have an exponential increase in the changes to the way people communicate through their social media or other web-based media platforms, time will tell. Now, knowing our place in the world, well, I've already hinted a little bit about this, but I do want to emphasise again, Australia is the 12th biggest economy of the world. Australia is in the top 10, sometimes recognised in the top 8 in terms of GDP per capita. But if you actually look at the Human Development Index, the United Nations publishes this. This is a combination of a whole range of factors, including economic factors. Guess where Australia comes? Not top. Finland is top.
Usually we're third.
Second is at the moment. So we are, in terms of the ranking, and they're the rankings there, by the way, we are coming in second. How many of us here in the debates about the concerns we have for our own economy and our own welfare and the dire straits that Australia is in, because and clearly people are losing their jobs with the demise of the auto industry? That's a terrible thing. But a little bit of comparative analysis about what's taking place in the world and where Australia stands might do us some good from time to time to wake up to ourselves and understand that Australia is not in a dire situation, but certainly hasn't been. It might be heading in a dire situation, and if policies are not good into the future, who knows what would happen. But at the moment, Australia is leading the G20. Australia is a member of the Security Council. Australia is the 12th biggest economy in the world. GDP per capita, we're in the top 10, and we're ranked number 2 in terms of human development. That's enough from me. Time for